Dr. Pratapaditya is one of the most distinguished and prolific of scholars on the history of Indian art. He is the author of numerous scholarly catalogues and has curated many exhibitions of Indian sculpture and Indian painting over the years. But his career has almost entirely been spent abroad. Indeed, he's an unusual, a rare visitor to these shores. So we're particularly privileged and excited that we have carved out a moment in Dr. Pal's busy schedule on this rare visit to talk to him about his career and his work and his views of the field of Indian art generally. Perhaps we could begin by talking about your early departure, your early career and your move from India, first of all to Cambridge and then to the United States. Tell us how that came about.
I left the country in 1962 with a scholarship, Commonwealth scholarship, to go to Cambridge, having finished my first doctorate in Calcutta University in what is called Ancient Indian History and Culture.
And who were you studying with in Calcutta?
Calcutta, I did my PhD with Professor Niharanjan Rai, an eminent authority in the field, and my subject there was actually architecture of Nepal. As a matter of fact, as I was telling your wife the other day, that I intended to be an architectural historian, but then I got this scholarship, so I went off to Cambridge to do a second PhD, which was mandatory in those days for Commonwealth scholars. And there I sort of finished off, rounded up Nepal by doing a thesis on sculpture and painting of Nepal. And that was a lucky break, which I did not know professionally, because instantly I became the authority in Nepal. So you see, it was smart to take a very unknown area, which is what one should do when one is doing PhD, in my opinion, to advance quickly professionally. And so, I mean, without publishing anything, I mean, I was considered a specialist in Himalayan art.
But of course you've since broadened out enormously from that, although you're known very much as a specialist also in Himalayan art, but you've worked in many other areas across the whole of the subcontinent.
Because my original interest was in Indian history and then art history and archaeology and then Himalayan art really, but anyway. And that, so I came back in '65.
And what happened to you then?
India.
Yes.
What happened was that I think I was overqualified and couldn't get a job. And I had several offers abroad, but I resisted for a year. But I think waiting for a job for a year is long enough. So I said, Boston Museum offered me the curator's job. Funny part of it is that I resisted going to the museums. I did not want to work for museums. I really wanted a university job.
But that's ironic in view of the fact you've
spent
your entire career working in very distinguished museums. Starting, of course, in Boston, where you were following in the footsteps of the great Kumaraswamy himself.
Exactly. When the director there interviewed me, he felt my reluctance, and he was very clever, and he said, Dr. Pal, if you come here, we'll even give you exact title that Kumaraswamy had, which was Keeper of the Indian Collection. Yes. So that difference between keeper, this British title, rather than curator, which is the American way of saying it,
But the Indian collections in Boston in Kumaraswamy's days were substantially Kumaraswamy's own collection, were they not? I mean,
the basic collection was. It was founded on Kumaraswamy's collections, but what people don't know is that Kumaraswamy really had, most of his collection was Rajput painting only, and minor arts, small things, objects. So everything else you see there, he acquired as a curator over a period of actively for about 15 years until his patron, Dr. Denman Ross, died. And so these facts are not known. Everyone thinks of the whole collection, but it's a small collection that he came with.
But he then built it up.
Then he built it up.
And where was he acquiring pieces from?
Well, this is very interesting. Of course, in those days you could buy directly from India. There was no problem. There's no problem at all of art going out of India until very recent times, number one. Number two, what is interesting, I'm glad you raised this point because it may be of interest to our conversation later, which is that Indian government gave the Boston Museum a number of objects as gifts, including Amaravati reliefs, a dozen of them, Nagapattinam Buddha of the 5th, 6th century, beautiful bronze.
So, and what date was this? This was in
This
in what
was
period
in
was
the
this?
20s.
In the 1920s.
Yeah, in the 1920s.
Yes.
There was this generosity then.
There was a feeling that India should indeed be reflected in the
Yes,
great
exactly.
collections, in the
There was
museum
no
collections
such
in
strict
America.
restriction. And he built it up, and two things. One is that it was the first Indian collection in America. He was the first curator of Indian art in America. By the time I arrived in 1967, they had just bought the Hiramani collection. You recall, yes, I mean, it was a great, the exhibition was in 1966 and sponsored by Boston because they bought the collection, which, if it had stayed in Boston, would have made Boston the largest collection of Indian art, repository of Indian art in America. But unfortunately, the contract was valid only for 3 years, sort of, and the museum terminated. The new curator there thought too much Indian art was being bought, and so they terminated the contract, and that's when Los Angeles jumped in and bought the rest, the major part of the Hiramani collection, and started the Indian, and then 3 years later I moved also.
In fact, you spent a substantial period of your career at the Los Angeles County
25
Museum of Art.
years.
25
Yeah,
years.
exactly.
And so you were also able to see that collection.
Then I was
build up
able
and-
to grow that collection because in the 70s, you know, there was no this kind of whatever the word is regarding buying Indian art. I mean, it was restricted by the government of India, of course, what could go out of India. But there was a lot of art to buy also. For instance, Hiramani collection was basically formed before 1970s, you see, so, and in the 40s and 50s. So a lot of it is that way clean. I hate to use this word, but
Yes,
you
we
see
understand, yes.
what the Antiquities Act has done has made Indian art unclean. It served exactly the opposite of this kind of restriction. If they had a sensible law, like the Japanese do, that keep the best works here, absolutely forbid A-class works to go out, and let others have
Let the
an
market
exchange,
decide
market
on
thing.
the remainder. Yes, I see.
In fact, it could be reciprocal. You see, the foreign exchange earned as a result of selling art abroad could be used to buy other areas of art like Chinese or Japanese or Western art, which we sadly lack.
You're suggesting, you mean, the government itself should be involved
the
in
government
selling
itself should be
works of art.
using the, you see.
Who would determine which pieces are of such national importance that they should never leave? And how
Well,
would you
there
put
should be
together
a body
committee?
of experts, knowledgeable people, not a body of political cronies who have no idea of what art, good art is. I mean, it has to be a group of experts that have a sensible, just as the National Museum has a purchasing committee, although I hear they hardly purchase anything now, but if you think of the 50, when it was founded, 50s, 60s, 70s, I mean, there were very knowledgeable people like Karl Kandalawala and others who had a broad knowledge of art. It has to be done sensibly, though. This is the problem. You cannot be over-nationalistic and follow Japan. How did the Japanese do it? They have a bunch of art historians who can agree on what is the great work and shouldn't go out. But if every fragment is considered to be a national treasure.
Tell us about your perception of the impact that it's had on collecting, particularly abroad.
I don't remember anyone really being conscious that they were doing something illicit if they were buying art in American market or European markets. You see, if we went to Sping, which was an open market, they were not hiding anything, and I saw an object, not only did I buy it for the museum, but I recommended it to the other collectors that I advised, and there was no thought of something, underground going on here. This has developed, I think, after the so-called UNESCO decision of much later that they took, that anything that comes out of any country of origin before 1972, I think, or 70, is kosher, but everything that came out of after 1970 is dirty.
Yes.
Now, who chose this arbitrary date?
Yes.
I gather it was decided by the American Museum Directors Association arbitrarily. But very funnily, they don't seem to apply it always to Western art that's coming out constantly.
Well, yes, I was going to ask you
European art.
Because the argument about the trade in antiquities often intersects with a separate argument, a different argument, which is about repatriation more generally. I mean, looking back to much earlier historical periods, to famous works of art that have ended up in museums, it's usually the discussion of the repatriation of art from Europe and America to Asia, rather than the other way around. But if one could look at the argument more broadly, what do you feel about the representation of different cultures in the great museums of the world?
I think it's an enormous asset. They're the silent ambassadors of the country. Again, I'm not saying that one should not have restrictions and one should be allowed to loot, but if you have a sensible policy and you allow exports and keep back the real national treasures, then what's the harm?
Because you've worked with a large number of collectors and collections, both public and private. You've worked with, we mentioned the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, but you've also worked with private collectors like Norton Simon, for example, who have all amassed large collections, particularly of Indian sculpture, in the post-independence period. Well, and before, I mean, as well, it crosses the divide of those two. Some of these collectors don't have particular links with India, they're not Indian collectors, they just have developed a taste and an understanding of Indian art. And their desire is to share this with an American public. Your view is that
Yes,
can only be a good thing.
they end up ultimately, most American collections, as you know, end up ultimately in public museums. So it becomes the property of the public at large. Now, we talk of having a global society and we are constantly exchanging ideas. I mean, if you think of the technological ideas that if internet, for instance, were not free and America said you cannot export any of the digital age information, okay, where would we be today? I'd like to know. I mean, in terms of economic development, think of the enormous number of jobs, etc. I mean, this very technology that we are using to record this or film this, I mean, wouldn't have been here. Where do we stop this sort of ridiculous idea that every painting painted by as a matter of fact, as you know, Mughal paintings went out of India long time ago. And hardly anything has gone out of independent India.
But I think there's a popular perception, at least among the Indian public, that the presence of Indian paintings of Mughal miniatures and Rajput paintings in museums abroad is just a sign of a relic of colonial plunder, that this is something to be deplored and
Well,
lost to
not
be
really.
regretted.
No, I think Mughal paintings were being appreciated in Europe, I think even before the British Empire was established really, okay? As you know better than I do. Okay, I wouldn't go into that. Think of the invention of the dome or Islamic architecture, and that went all over Asia. I mean, India's proudest monument is almost what has become symbolic of India is a Muslim monument, okay?
Yes.
And in a sense, this blind thing that everything made in India has to come back to India. I mean, art is one commodity, one aspect. The visual art is only one aspect of Indian creativity.
Would you make a distinction between paintings and sculpture? Because one could argue that paintings have always been, as it were, a commodity that's been traded. From the moment that an emperor commissions a painting and pays for it, it becomes a piece of property that he can then give as a gift, as they did. I mean, the Mughal emperors gave diplomatic gifts to their Rajput colleagues and to foreigners and so on. So they've always been transferable commodities. Whereas in the case of sculpture, and a lot of your own scholarly work has focused on sculpture, devotional sculpture, which starts out very often as part of a building. And so that you're looking at a work of art in isolation, removed from its original context. Do you think there would be a stronger argument in that case for returning things
there
to
is
sites?
First of all a broader philosophical issue that does an isolated sculpture separated from its architectural context, does it have an aesthetic validity as an object in itself in a museum? It is in a sense an artificial environment.
One could say that of course it does, but it has a different significance from what it has.
Of course, we can find, I can say, yes, if it's floating around and neglected and lying somewhere, then it's better to be, for the sake of preservation and other things. I mean, I can cite to you innumerable sculptures from great monuments rotting in very filthy, dirty conditions in some museum storage somewhere here. Okay?
Yes.
Because we don't have that kind of facility, museums don't have the conservation department. And yet, the most insignificant fragment of Indian art, as you know, or even a little terracotta object, most of which were floating objects anyway. They were not, let's say, unless it's from a terracotta temple, but I'm talking of the early terracottas that are found everywhere. I mean, should they have been allowed to go back to dust unto dust? I wouldn't. I'd much rather see it in I'll give you an example. There are thousands of terracottas preserved in the storage of the British Museum that were taken in those times. And these are also historical documents, but nobody asked about them. You see, there's another psychology, You notice whenever you hear of some Indian art object, how did it start with that Norton Simon Shivapuram Nataraja? Was it really that the bronze was excavated in the temple of Shivapuram? But then why didn't anybody claim it while it was publicly displayed in the owner's house in Bangalore for about 15 years? Okay, and people like Shivaram Murthy, the director of the National Museum, and others went day after day. Whenever they visited Bangalore, they went to the owner's house and he used to offer prayers there. When the owner died, what was either the Karnataka government or the federal government here doing? not making sure and going and saying to the widow, we'll keep this bronze here. It's an important thing. No. The minute it goes out, and then a dealer in America asks for the price of 1 million. Now here's the rub. You see, it was the first $1 million bronze. All hell broke loose in India. So was it the monetary value of the object? Was it its aesthetic importance, or was it its religious importance?
I think, as you say, the price tag certainly focused attention.
Well,
let's
you
say,
said that, I didn't, but I'm just saying that.
But that piece was returned, is it not?
And you see, again, we are using Western concepts to value these objects. The Nataraja found underground is a deconsecrated object. According to any good Hindu, and we are trying to claim our Hindu ownership of this country, well then learn about Hinduism first and what Hindu laws say before yelling, in fact copying the Western some. And who raises these issues? You notice a few American journalists, if I may say so, in front of these journalists who are filming this, they have become sensationalizers.
Yeah, no, well, smuggling is always good copy.
See, it makes good copy,
Yes.
as you say, sells newspapers, whatever, and scandal. So therefore it becomes also, so all these values increase the sort of, suddenly, it's not about the object. Where is the Shivapuram Nataraja? Why can't you, living in India as a scholar, go and see the Shivaram?
Where is it now?
Where is it now? It should have been displayed in the National Museum. The Tamil Nadu government forced the central government to go to court in London and spent much more than the millions, the price that was asked for it, to bring it back, and nobody has access to it. It's locked up under some, wherever it is, some fort somewhere.
When you were in Los Angeles, you talked about building up the collections over the years, but you also very significantly built up a very strong department of young scholars. You were joined there over the years by a number of very able younger scholars who then have gone on to great things in their own careers. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your view of the role of scholarship in museums, particularly as distinct from in university departments.
I was fortunate enough that concurrently to my museum job, I also had a university teaching position. So therefore, I was able to nurture younger minds to go on to the subject. But I think what helped them was their museum experience and learning to work with objects. You see, one of the, I know now, of course, in the digital age, it's become enormously advantageous to be able to study art through the computer screen, because you can do miracles by going and watching details that you'd never be able to do even with slides. But there's nothing, as you know, nothing like looking at the art itself. The best way to learn about an object is to look at it and rub noses with it, or go and see the building. I mean, in fact...
Well, it's indispensable in the case of architecture.
Yeah,
yes,
architecture, I feel, cannot be studied except eye to eye, because the physical environment, the volume of and all these things matter enormously. I remember when they appointed me as an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California, where I mostly taught, but then also other California universities. They didn't have a PhD program in art history at all, and I insisted with the dean that you have to, because I can't imagine simply teaching undergraduates. It will be very unsatisfying. And so he said, fine, let's do it, and come up with a project, and I pushed through. And that wasn't for Indian art, it was for all art history. USC did not have a PhD program in art history when I joined. So that was opened up. I feel that the basic training of a curator has to be academic and learning all about all aspects of art. Not just the eye is very important, but that's sort of God-given in a sense, I believe, in the sense that it's if you don't have a natural empathy and don't see the beauty of something, you're not going to be able to learn really to simply see it. But there are other important aspects for a museum curator job or collector's job, preservation of the object, and everything. You have to have a very sound knowledge of the actual art. Simply theoretical knowledge is useless. I mean, then you can start building theories, but after...
But the two go hand in hand, as you say. Whether you call them keepers or curators, the first duty implied by the title is to take care of an object. But it is also to promote understanding of it and to enrich understanding.
But for that, eye alone doesn't do it either. See, for that you have to have knowledge.
Yes.
So you have to be directed to go and read the proper texts and whatever, and what theory. If you suddenly take a modern theory from Western sociology or something, because it's very fashionable, and you try to apply it, but the art wasn't created by people who knew modern sociology. You have to go and think of each art of each culture on its own terms also. And this is where I think students become confused, especially in America, where there's been an enormous emphasis on theory for the sake of theory.
But now you're talking about the study of the history of art in a university context,
yes,
rather than
right.
a museum where it remains connected with the object.
Different. That's what I'm saying.
So the other challenge, I think, for those who work in museums is that you're presenting exhibitions and catalogues to a wide audience, to a general public, and to some degree, therefore, you have to be a popularizer. You can't always present the cutting-edge research ideas. In a lot of your writing, you've done that magnificently. You have been a popularizer. You write in a very clear, accessible style. Tell us a bit about your own view of the importance of reaching out to the general public.
Language is really the means of communication between human beings. I mean, that has to be known, that you're not writing only for a few friends or few academics or whatever, that it should be, the more people read yours. I mean, you've just, for instance, written a novel. I mean, now there you are. It's not, whether it's related to art history or not is immaterial, but you've gone into a broader form of communication. And I might throw the compliment that you also write very readable way. Now this I learned frankly from the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, number one. I think the first influence, because from so early in my life I was reading him from about age 5, that I never found anything he wrote about difficult to understand. And he wrote about lots of things I have no interest in it. But when I used to read them, I used to say, how does he write such obtuse subjects in such easily readable Bengali? And then when I started reading history, I read people like G.M. Trevelyan and, it was like novel, really. I mean, I still remember, who wrote it? Whose book was it on Tudor history, where he started saying Henry V, was it, who picked up the crown at the field of Bosworth with a lance? No, that's poetry. It's been ingrained in me from early childhood to write so that a broad public can understand whatever you're writing, no matter how obtuse the subject is. But most scholars seem to prefer to write only for their own kind.
16 years, I think it was, you were general editor of Marg, the magazine, which has a similar aim to reach out to a very broad readership.
Absolutely.
So tell us about your experience with working with Marg?
Marg was founded with a much broader scope.
It's founded by Mulk Raj Anand.
Mulk Raj Anand, than it is now. That much I'll give it. It's become more an art historical journal. I think it's partly because we just don't find the kind of writers that used to, and the readership is different, and so part of the evolution has been, I think, because of the change of ideas, and from 1946 when it was founded, and say to the 21st century. I took it up, I think, 1993, and if to be honest with you, Giles, I was not consciously trying to change or anything. If you do perceive any change, fine. I wanted things to be not to sacrifice scholarly integrity, but to be accessible and readable to more people.
Let's talk finally about your current work, because I'm sure there has not been a moment in the last 50, 60 years when you haven't been writing a book. What are you writing now?
Actually, I'm involved in two projects. One is writing about collecting Indian art from 1900 to 1950, 47, let's say. It was actually the most glorious period of collecting pre-colonial Indian art, not modern and contemporary, because in fact they are actually concomitant, because as you know, because of nationalism, and after Havel came and taught us Indians how to
appreciate
old Indian art,
yes,
that all this Rajput Mughal stuff came about. In fact, I think one of the most interesting discoveries I've made in doing this, that we regard Kumaraswamy as the sort of discoverer of Rajput painting. That's utter nonsense. He did not discover Rajput painting. He learned about Rajput painting from the two Tagore brothers. He was the pioneering publisher of Rajput painting. So this, published by Marg, I had committed it to them. Apart from that, I got involved in organizing and conceptualizing an exhibition for Santa Barbara on Indian art, Hindu, Buddhist and Jain. Now, it's not, I didn't have the freedom to select objects to do the show. What happened is that Santa Barbara has a core collection of Indian religious art, sculptures and paintings, and they wanted to showcase it in an exhibition. So at my suggestion, we broadened it to include some objects borrowing from private collections, so that to encourage them to give them ultimately to Santa Barbara Museum. Among them, there is one Indian collector of Indian origin, whom I had cultivated for many years, and I had channeled him to collect Indian wood sculpture, because it's been ignored. With all this together, it will be an exhibition, and because now it's not going to be an aesthetic experience per se, because it's not a masterpiece show. I hate this word masterpiece and master. I think in Indian context it has very little meaning. It may be okay for European painting. I mean, we have acknowledged, there's only one Leonardo and one Picasso. But simply to say another master painter, another master unknown painter, and sculpture particularly are all by unknown sculptors. So let's say, so these objects, a mixed bag, A, B and C, and so I said to myself, now here you see I theorized from the facts, okay? I looked at the objects and I said, if I present this as a major exhibition with major works, they're not major works, I don't have the thing. I couldn't choose the objects for a body kind of show, let's say, give an example. So since it's a mixed bag, what do? I said, let's look at it from its, why were these sculptures used? So I've given it the title of Puja and Piety. So that it's an expression of devotion first, and it was used, so it has ritual use, whether outside a temple or inside a temple. And so it will be Puja and Piety, Hindu, Buddhist and Jain art from India, Indian subcontinent, and all three religions. And in doing so, I found interesting, I've got three eminent scholars to write on Puja and Piety in Buddhism, in Jainism and Hinduism.
You've had experience of working with very important public collections in museums, but also with private collections. And also some of your work has brought these two spheres together very considerably. And I wondered if you would like to reflect a little on where you would like to see the development of the role of individuals, of individual collectors particularly. What do you think they have to contribute to public institutions, to national museums?
Since I've worked in America, I must tell you that the only reason why American museums are great is because of private collectors. Because most private collections end up, there are very few people who can afford to establish their own museums in America. It's too costly, and museums have encouraged that also always. So it's a wonderful private-public partnership. But that is impossible yet in India. And it didn't happen in India, that's why a lot of art went out. Yeah. Now there is another way to keep art in the country, is to encourage private collecting. And now that Indians, I've met enough rich Indians to say, I can build you 10 museums here. They'll be more than glad to give their collections, but the museum attitude has to change.
So how do we go about making these necessary changes?
Government has to get out of the business of running museums. We have to, there is a lot of talent here, I noticed in the last 10 years with the rise of contemporary art. Again, price determined that. You notice that money is the fundamental issue in this, not all your nationalism and aesthetic considerations and all. And a lot of young people are working for private galleries and companies and others. And I once heard about the design of the Bharani show that you did in the National Gallery. That it was spectacularly shown. Okay? Now, why can't that be done by the museum staff itself? So we should bring those young people, talent that is here, that's either going out or going to commercial galleries and all. Why aren't they being recruited? Why aren't they getting museum jobs?
Positive spin on that, you would suggest that given a little shift in attitudes, there is actually very considerable scope for development and growth within India.
Absolutely. I think it's the attitude has to change, and that's going to be very tough. The way I worked, rather than money, I said, you give whatever the museum is spending on your collection, you give me art worth that much.
Excellent.
Thank you.